Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Rolling Stories, the HR podcast brought to you by Rolling Arrays. In today's world, companies are bought and sold at a rapid rate. We see smaller tech companies, even smaller companies being bought by larger ones. We've seen huge conglomerates merge together under one banner and a combination of other integration that largely fall under the merger and acquisition or M&A header. Now, despite this trend though, we see very little about HR's actual role in all of this. HR, after all, will be the department that helps this integration go smooth, the department that's tasked with making sure that the two companies and culture that come together during a merger and acquisition can do so in a way that keeps the business running. And with that, we are very fortunate today to have Andrew Swinley to join us today to help us shed some light on this M&A when it comes to a HR-focused initiative. Hi, Andrew. Welcome to the show.
Hey, hi, Adrian. Thanks for having me.
To begin with, could you help the audience to understand a bit about yourself and the level of involvement you have when it comes to M&A and how the HR aspect come into place?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the global head of people for Kape Technologies, which is the parent company. Our most famous brand is ExpressVPN, so many of your listeners may have heard of that. It's a very timely question on how I'm involved in M&A because literally we're just coming to the end of an integration process. So I joined what was ExpressVPN in August 2021, and literally in December of that same year, ExpressVPN was acquired by Kape Technologies. So we were straight into an M&A situation. And from an HR perspective, really the direction from management was, as part of the acquisition deal, brought 4 VPN brands together under one company, and there was a direction to create one division with these VPN brands.
And lessons definitely we hope to distill from this conversation. But before that, let's take a step back and look at it from a HR lens. When it comes to M&A in which HR has to come in to play a part to ensure there's synergy, everything is harmonized between two organizations. What are some of the obvious challenge for any HR practitioner, especially when they're new to such an experience?
I think the biggest thing is that just human beings tend to be resistant to change in the first place. I think HR has a really key role in managing people along that change curve. And the way we do that is to really plan very well and think ahead on what is it we're trying to do here? What do we expect some of the common issues we have when people are faced with change, and try to be ready to address them head on. People are tribal by nature and they tend to prefer their own ways of doing things. So it's not as easy as just saying, hey, we're going to do an integration and things have to change and that's just the way of it. Even though that is the sort of top-down direction, you still need to win the hearts and minds of people to bring them along with you on that journey.
And obviously, I would imagine for there will be some HR considerations, and it also depends on whether you're coming from the company that is acquiring or you are the company being acquired. What are some of the things that you would imagine HR department should be truly mindful of even before the entire exercise takes place, when they first got notified, hey, an M&A is happening? What is the top 3 things that you believe HR should immediately look into to really prepare themselves and make sure, as you mentioned, the entire exercise become as seamless as possible?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And for me, I think the thing I've learned, sometimes the painful way, is spend as much time as you can on the discovery aspect of it. So albeit I just said the expectation is these things get done very quickly. Look at your whole time scale that you have and figure out just how much of that you can spend on just talking to your counterparts, talking to other parts of the business that are going to be integrated, because the more you can find out in the early stages, the less nasty surprises you have earlier on. And sometimes you can surface out things that are going to be a real showstopper, that you get so far down a path and then suddenly you hit this roadblock. Then you have to kind of redo a whole bunch of work because you didn't think about this. And again, particularly in the HR space, great examples of that are things like legal requirements. So in the integration I just did, we went from having offices in 5 countries to offices in about 11 countries now. And obviously, each country has different employment legislation. So some of the things that we just assumed, hey, we're just going to roll out this HR process everywhere, it'll be fine. We found out a bit too late in some instances that is actually illegal in certain markets to do things in that way. So with the benefit of hindsight, had we spent more time talking to the HR or the legal departments in each of these markets, we could have probably surfaced this stuff out and had a plan to address it way ahead of time. rather than sort of last minute and be trying to scrabble around to change things.
I always share with people, if you don't control the narrative, people will fill in the gaps, just like what you mentioned. And usually the internal monologue for each of us are usually slant towards the negative side. So it's very important to control that narrative.
No.
And there's so many questions that I want to dive into, but maybe I will touch on the communication aspect later on. But I would also want to understand, given that you have visibility to so many different M&A in your prior experience, in your current job as well, and probably also reading up on many other different M&A cases, case studies, which are perhaps not something they've undergone. Are there also some common mistakes that company tend to make when it comes to an M&A exercise, especially very much on the HR aspect?
So I think there are probably two mistakes. So one of it is related to communication again. I think it's very easy to assume people understand what's going on, and because the CEO or whoever has communicated, hey, this change is going to happen. We're doing integration. Here's a whole bunch of stuff you can go and read to find out about it. They okay, job done. Communication is there, and then they expect no bumps along the road. But in my experience, you cannot just communicate once, or employees are very selective about what they take out of a communication. And then especially if you need these employees to do something as part of the work to do the M&A, if they don't understand it, then again you have the risk of going down the wrong path. You take actions that are not in line with what you're trying to achieve. So it's really about, again, being clear on what you're trying to say and rechecking that. So if you don't go back and have a great stakeholder map of who are the key people for this integration, you can argue obviously all employees are important in integration, but there's probably going to be...
And likely they will also have questions, right? Because the contractual terms will be different and you also require them to acknowledge it, and that will take some time. And time is something which you also mentioned earlier on is usually on the shorter side when it comes to M&A, because I would imagine companies want to get it done and over with. Based on your observation and your experience, what is a typical timeline from the date of announcement to the date of completion? What is the kind of timeline company would want to have this M&A thing concluded?
I mean, I would say, I guess in some ways it depends on the size and complexity of the company. But for a company my size, which is moderately complex, but it's not a huge MNC, we give ourselves a year to do the integration. And by that, I mean, I guess it's the big chunks of integration. So it's creating the new structures, bringing people together into this division that I talked about, the houses, all the VPN brands. So the big chunks of it, I think, should be done in no more than a year. Some of the more softer side of integration, I think, can take longer than that. So how you create an integrated culture, how you win these hearts and minds, how you sort of convince people that belong to one big happy family.
That's a really good point. And I think it also segues very well to my next question, which is really very much on the cultural differences. I've seen quite a number of acquisition M&A happen during my earlier days of recruitment. I still remember one of our clients was Bex Global, and then they had this M&A with Schenker, which you can imagine is very interesting even on paper, because you're talking about a US company and a German company, obviously on opposite spectrum. Yeah. And cultural differences would always be the most challenging aspect, in my opinion, when it comes to two companies coming together. Obviously, if they are within the same country, probably that is much lesser an issue. But we are looking at cross-continent kind of acquisition, maybe a Japanese company acquiring a Chinese company, acquiring an India company. Cultural differences might really make or break the deal. What's your opinion on that? And what are some of the strategies HR can really look at to align all these cultures during the merger as well as post?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think this is sometimes where integrations live and die, right? If you cannot get people into the same space sort of from a company culture perspective, then you're going to be fighting these issues for a long time. And like you said there, this integration that we've just gone through was quite cross-cultural, because if you look at the geographical footprint of the companies that have all come together, there wasn't much overlap previously. So ExpressVPN was quite heavily Asia-based in terms of employees, and a bit in the UK, and a bit in Poland, whereas as the Kape brands were not so much in Asia and more concentrated in mainland Europe, but not in Poland or the UK per se. So again, from that different countries have different cultural perspectives. Definitely, we were facing that. And I think from the HR perspective, I think one of the best ways to manage that is, first of all, be very intentional about, if you can't meet in person, and I think a video call is better because you can at least see the person, you can get a sense of how they're reacting and read the body language and stuff like that. So certainly for most of, I can't imagine how much of my time I've spent on looking into a computer video camera in the last year, but it's been a lot. But I think it's been very worthwhile.
And the video recording will also be there, right? Which again emphasize the need to over communicate and to have the repetition. It sounds like a very parental approach, the way that I communicate with my kids to, clean up yourself, please clean up your room, make sure you pick this up. But I guess to especially for larger organizations, you really have to do so. Just that one single memo may not reach the minds and importantly the hearts of every single employee. Of course, as with all exercise, be it different departments within the organization, there always has to be a measurement to see how successful we are. Are there any specific metrics when it comes to M&A exercise from the HR perspective? Any metrics that you use to track progress to ensure that everything is on top of plan?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things you can look at. I mean, some are sort of explicit metrics and some are more implicit metrics. I think one tool we use to gauge the success is our employee net promoter score survey, where it's basically a staff opinion survey, where when we started the integration, so this is something we run every 6 months anyway, but when we started doing integration, we added some specific integration questions into this survey, asking questions like, I understand what's the purpose of integration, I feel like my department is working better as a result of integration activity, and some other questions like that. So we put them in right at the very start of the process. We asked the questions halfway through the process, and we asked the questions at the end of the process. Happy to say all those metrics improved significantly as we went through it. But if they weren't, that would definitely be a very strong indicator that you need to take a look at that.
I really like what you mentioned about using referral as a matrix, because referral is something so personable, right? If you really think that company that you're in is worth the salt, you definitely want to refer your friends in, and you wouldn't refer just anyone. You wouldn't refer your crazy neighbor. You also have a reputation to upkeep. But the sheer fact that this is going down is a clear indication that the perception of the company may have changed, may have shifted in a negative way. And I'm reminded of this saying by Tony Robbins. He often said, success leaves clues. But I think the opposite is true as well. Failures also leave clues. So we just have to pay attention to the outcome, and this will give us a very different perspective of things.
Yeah, for sure.
And lastly, before we go and end today's podcast, any final words or parting shots you would like to give to HR professionals who are entirely new to an M&A exercise and may be facing this process for the very first time?
So I think, I guess it comes back a little bit to what I said at the start. Be clear on, what is the objective of this M&A? Why did it go down in the first place? Think as far ahead as you can and spend that time on learning as much about the new organization that's going to be acquired or you're going to be part of, and find out as much as you can and spend as much time on that as possible. I think the main piece of advice is actually don't be afraid of it. Most of our HR principles still apply. Whether you're doing it in an M&A setting or whether you're doing it in a BAU setting, it's all about treating people fairly. It's about making sure the correct policies and processes are in place. It's thinking about the employee experience.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Andrew, for people who may wish to learn more about yourself and what you do, where can they go to?
So I'm on LinkedIn. If you look up under Andrew Swinley on LinkedIn, my everything about me is there. My contact details are there as well. If anybody wants to reach out and talk more about M&As or indeed any other part of HR, I'm very happy to connect and take the discussion from there.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you so much for giving us the rundown on M&A exercise from a HR perspective. I'm very certain a lot of our listeners would have found this so engaging and so interesting, especially those who may be facing the reality of an M&A exercise or purely just to perhaps help them to better understand the entire process on how to manage it in the future. With that, thank you so much for coming onto the show today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.